We are coming out of 30 years during which we genuinely believe that the end of history had happened, the geopolitical competition just wasn't a thing anymore. We still struggle to make sense of what's happening. We still have slightly absurd debates, about EU nuclear bombs and I don't know what. Modernizing and reforming the Bundeswehr, so the German armed forces, has shown to be incredibly difficult. Germans and Germany would still very much prefer a situation where the world would just leave them alone.
This is a conversation with Dr. Ulrike Franke, a senior policy fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations, who's focusing on German security, defense, and foreign policy. We talked about how has Germany changed since the beginning of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and whether the German public has abandoned its pacifism, why Germany still refuses to provide Taurus missiles to Ukraine, and why it struggles so much to rebuild its military, or whether Germany should get its own nuclear bomb. Thank you so much to everyone who's supporting this podcast on Patreon. And now, enjoy the conversation.
All right, so welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
So I think a good place to start would be looking back at 2 years ago, since it's been now over 2 years since the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and since Olaf Scholz, the German chancellor, announced his big radical turn in German foreign and defense policy in his Zeitenwende speech. And if we look back at it now, in your view, did this radical change that he announced and promised at the time, did it really happen? And if it did, then how different is Germany today when it comes to foreign and defense policy to the Germany that we could have seen 2 years ago?
Right, yeah, that's obviously a very big question. So first of all, I think it's really important to remember one thing, and that is that Olaf Scholz on the 27th of February, so 3 days after the Russian invasion, he didn't in fact really announce the Zeitenwende, the turn of times, but rather stated that it was happening, or kind of observed that it was happening. And I think this is already important because it shows that it wasn't quite as active as sometimes it was portrayed afterwards. But of course, you are also right that Olaf Scholz in this speech didn't just say, oh my God, the world is changing, but did also announce a number of things that Germany would do and would do differently. Most importantly, I would argue a kind of modernization and renewed effort to build up the Bundeswehr, the special fund of 100 billion euro that is to be spent for the Bundeswehr, but also very importantly, weapons deliveries to Ukraine, which, previous to the invasion had been a big topic of debate. And some listeners may remember that kind of, immediately after the invasion, the German defense minister just, talked about delivering some helmets. But very quickly, the German government and Scholz changed their mind on that and kind of announced weapons deliveries then. What has changed since then? Honestly, this is very much a kind of glass half full, glass half empty situation. On the one hand, I could really talk for 20 minutes about how much German society and the German political realm and their view on all things military and defense really has changed enormously over the last 2 years. As someone who has been working on kind of German defense and security topics for, over a decade, it was just so striking to see how the interest in these topics has gone up, the kind of willingness to engage with them, a new understanding of the importance of the military. I mean, I don't want to spend ages on this, but just before the invasion, to give you a certain sense, there really was a general rejection of all things military in Germany because it was so closely linked to, our past and us being aggressors. And so military really was seen as something negative and in a way also something obsolete, something that you don't really need anymore because, the world has moved on and international disputes are now solved by international law, or the competition is really happening on the trade side and in economics rather than in the military realm. And so this is why the Russian invasion was such a shock. And so the whole German population and German society really had to get reacquainted in a way with debates about military things and all of this. And yes, so on the one hand, the change has been enormous, quite honestly. I see this every day, the kind of requests and reactions I get, the interest that's there, a new understanding. So there's the real change. And of course, the 100 billion fund was created and has been spent, not completely, but a good chunk of it for new equipment. Germany's buying the F-35 and other systems. Germany has become the most important supporter of Ukraine after the United States over the last 2 years. So the numbers here also are really important. So again, I can spend 20 minutes about all the things that have changed. On the other hand, it still shows that, we are coming out of 30 years during which we genuinely believe that the end of history had happened. The geopolitical competition just wasn't a thing anymore, or at least not in the political realm, in the military realm, and kind of in terms of a military confrontation. We still struggle to make sense of what's happening. We still have slightly absurd debates, about EU nuclear bombs and I don't know what. Modernizing and reforming the Bundeswehr, so the German armed forces, has shown to be incredibly difficult. And it's not going as fast as we would like it to. My biggest frustration, in a way, is that the relationship with the German defense industry wasn't kind of reinvigorated earlier, so they kind of lost months during which apparently nothing or very little was ordered, and not just for Ukraine. I'm really talking for the German capabilities themselves. So yeah, I really, depending on almost how I feel on a certain day, I can give you the 20-minute speech on how much has changed, and also the 20-minute speech on how it's still so slow, it's still peacetime mode, and nothing, not nothing, but very little is happening. So yeah, you kind of have both sides of the medal. But given where we started, I think the changes are certainly noteworthy. But the big question, of course, and that's what matters in defense and security, is it enough?
So I think you've mentioned a lot of things that deserve a closer look. So I want to kind of look at each of them in more detail. And the first one, and one maybe the most important one, obviously, if we talk about defense, is the military. And specifically the military reform that the German leadership has announced, that the German military that has been notoriously underfunded and under-equipped needs to be upgraded in equipment, and needs to be increased in size, and it needs to become combat ready, as the German defense minister put it. So if we look at it now, because 2 years is not that long, but it's not nothing, how is this military reform going so far, and how far is Germany progressed in achieving this goal?
So from what I hear from inside the ministry, also the Berlin bubble and the troop, I think there are real problems and real challenges in reforming and modernizing the whole system. Germany's armed forces are 182,000 people. They should be 185,000, but there are always recruitment issues, so it doesn't quite reach that number. And it's a huge ministry, and it's genuinely difficult to reform, especially because the whole system was created with a peacetime thinking and in a peacetime setting. And that's not, you can't really criticize this, because that was the reality at the time, and we really had these kind of decades, Germany being surrounded by friends, and all of these things, the NATO umbrella being so strong, and almost so it felt not needed because there was no threat and all of this. So I think we're still very much seeing that this peacetime mode and these peacetime procedures still continue. This has to do a lot with bureaucracy. So bureaucracy is a general topic, by the way, in the German state and kind of the German administration. Low levels of digitization, everything kind of needs two signatures and needs to go back and forth and things like that. So that seems very difficult. So I guess, are we combat ready? It's always difficult to answer, but I think the modernization has been more difficult than maybe outsiders would have thought, especially because, and I think this is worth remembering, this isn't the first time since like the 80s that Germany has tried to create reforms in the armed forces. In fact, since 2014, since Russia invasion, annexation of Crimea, there have already been changes put in place in Germany, and indeed previous defense ministers, most importantly Ursula von der Leyen, who now of course is EU Commission President, had put in place what she called the kind of Trendwenden, so kind of changes in tact, if you like, inside the Bundeswehr. So it's not just the last 2 years; it's say the last 10 years, and for that. Looking at it from the outside, it seems to me that we have too little to show for it, and things seem to be too difficult. And reforms that Pistorius, the current defense minister, has been trying to put in place are kind of hindered by, again, bureaucracy and protests from within the ministry and all of that. So it's definitely difficult. Maybe just one sentence on size, because you mentioned this. So as I said, the German Bundeswehr is 182 or 3,000 people, should be 185. And in fact, there is a plan to increase the number to 203,000 over the next years. This is independent of the Zeitenwende, independent of this war. This was already put in place before. I was never really convinced by why that number and why these kind of 15,000 people more would make the difference. But I think what is clear is that the Bundeswehr struggles to get these people because we do have recruitment issues. Not dissimilar to, say, France or the UK or other countries. I mean, this is a general problem in the Western and especially European countries, has mostly to do with demographics and other things. But the size and recruitment is one of the topics that Germany also is struggling with. So at this point, there are still gaps and things that need to be better and need to be improved a bit everywhere.
I think maybe just a small tangent, but it does seem surprising to me that Germany is struggling with implementing these steps, and especially fighting with bureaucracy. And I don't want to be too stereotypical, but Germany does tend to have this reputation of a country that is very functional, and it does have a very competent leadership and bureaucracy. So my initial impression was that once the country decided that something is a priority, it would then be very effective in implementing it.
Yeah, I mean, many Germans would just tell you that the stereotype just no longer holds true, in the same way that the German trains are now always late. Like, that seems to be was such a cliche, and now it's like the opposite. So, no, I mean, yes, yeah. In general, it's a functional country, but especially over the last few years, you could really feel how. And again, this really is mainly about bureaucracy, procedures, and kind of a lack of digitization. Things seem slower and more difficult than in many other countries. Because there are these kind of big procedures, that also in the end usually means that it works. So it's not, things aren't being done willy-nilly by whoever wants them to be. So that's where the stereotype still holds true. But I think, doing reforms in general in the German system and in the Ministry of Defense in particular is just very tricky. And so I find it also difficult to kind of criticize the current defense minister, because again, as far as one is able to tell from the outside, he really seems to be trying his best. And it's not going as fast as one would like it to.
Yeah, it also does seem to me like the German defense minister is really trying his hardest to push this through. But maybe one more aspect of the military reform which is necessary for really any major military reform in any country, is funding. Basically, how you're going to pay for all this investments and upgrades that you're planning. And Germany has this special 100 billion euro investment fund, thanks to which it, if I'm not wrong, and maybe you can correct me, manages to achieve the 2% of GDP commitment of military spending. But there is the issue of what happens once this fund runs out, and also the fact that now 2% are seen as sort of the bottom level.
The lower limit.
rather than a target we should aspire to. So what is the thinking about how to pay for all of this, especially since Germany does have, significant economic difficulties at the moment, and it has a lot of other commitments that it wants to push through, like green transformation of its economy and infrastructure, and being fiscally responsible.
Yes, so Germany hasn't met the 2% goal, so the goal of spending 2% of its GDP on defense, which is NATO's kind of guideline for the last years. It was always significantly below, depending on which numbers you believe. It's somewhere between 1.3 and 1.5. Indeed, on the 27th of February 2022, Olaf Scholz announced the 100 billion special fund. And if you count that in, which of course you can, Germany is now reaching more or less the 2%. However, this fund will run out by definition in a few years. It's kind of a 5-year or so program. And the big fear is that if then the defense budget doesn't increase accordingly, we are kind of falling off a cliff which will be all deeper because of the stuff that was bought with the 100 billion fund, right? Because if you're now buying 35 F-35s, you have more maintenance costs in a few years because these are expensive planes to maintain and all of that. And this is just one example, right? We're buying equipment that then is more expensive. So just spending 100 billion and kind of going back to the situation before, then you're worse off than you were before in a way. The current kind of signaling out of Berlin is to say, no, we're going to reach the 2%. Unfortunately, I haven't really seen great plans on how they want to do that. So you kind of have to just trust that they will be doing that. And personally, I am reasonably confident that somehow, I don't know whether it's going to be 2%, but the defense spending will increase significantly enough to really make a difference. It's just that if you can't really plan with this, if we aren't really sure, that's not great, and that's not great for the industry. So this is really a problem. And the other problem is, and this is super difficult to communicate because 100 billion euro is a lot of money, but already at the time, experts who had, kind of calculated these things already said, 100 billion, we kind of need 300 billion. We need way more money. Communicating this to the general population is tricky, especially as you just alluded to. The German economy has some challenges. It's still, Germany is a very big and strong economy, making a lot of money, and generally fiscally responsible and has more money than most Europeans. There's kind of relative aspect to this. But yeah, there are big challenges, from green transformation to the fact that we're so dependent on the car industry, which also has all its challenges from the electric car industry, et cetera, et cetera. So many things. And as you say, the 2% goal of NATO, this was again a little bit more of a peacetime thinking. Defense spending during the Cold War was way higher. And obviously defense spending in countries that actually do wage wars is way, way higher. So 2% isn't really that much, and it was already, I think, was it at the last NATO summit? But at one point, it actually was kind of said, like, okay, this is really now certainly not just something to achieve and be happy with, but kind of the minimum that you want to spend. And there are already discussions, right, in the UK and elsewhere, whether this goal should be kind of pushed to 3% or something like that. All this to say that I think that the challenge of the funding is there. It's certainly not impossible, right? We're not in a situation where we are like, oh my God, we need so much more money and we don't have it. You can always find money, and Germany in particular does have some leeway. Again, it has challenges. It also, by the way, has the political challenge of the debt brake, which is this kind of constitutional rule that Germany isn't allowed to borrow much more money than it's spent. And let's not go into the details, but it makes borrowing really hard, politically speaking. So they might have to change that depending on what they didn't want to do. So this is a challenge, but it's not an insurmountable one. But it's a difficult challenge politically speaking. And unfortunately, the current government, we have a 3-party coalition in Germany. We always have coalition governments. 3 parties is a lot, though. Normally it's 2. And they disagree on a lot. It's not the most... it's not unstable, but it is quite controversial. There's a lot of noise coming out of this coalition. So it's not they do have a lot of disputes, and so this also makes it harder, I guess, to find that kind of money.
And would you say, I don't know if there are any data on that, but would you say that there is sort of a wide understanding or support among the public and among the political representation that this is something that we just need to invest money into, even though we might need to cut the money somewhere else? Or is it something that the government will have to push through against the will of the majority of the people?
The German population's view on the military has moved quite a bit since the beginning of the war. Because again, I almost want to say for the first time in my generation, people really realized that the military, it's not just there because you somehow need a military, and it's not just there because you may have to do things like, the operations in Afghanistan or Mali, which weren't really popular to begin with, but that the military at its fundamental level is there to defend yourself and defend your allies, right? And this is something that people just kind of re-understood in a way, which has, I'd say, generally increased and improved the view of the military in general, the arms industry as well. And so I think there is certainly more of a willingness to say, okay, this is something that we need to spend money on. Yes, everybody would rather spend money on kindergartens than military equipment, me included, but you may need the military equipment to make sure that the kindergartens can run and are in safety. So that's point one. I think it's certainly not that the population somehow clearly against this. Not that they're like super enthusiastic, of course, but something to work with. And to work with is actually the good phrase here, because what we've also seen over the last 2 years is that because this is a tricky situation, it's a complex situation, and it is in a field that very few people are familiar with, political guidance, political leadership, and political kind of explaining really plays a fundamental role. And you can see this in the polls. Because interestingly enough, there were a few controversial issues regarding supporting Ukraine, right? Let's say the deliveries of Leopard tanks. As long as the government, and Olaf Scholz in particular, were against this and kind of made the arguments against this, a majority of Germans was also against it. Not 70%, but whatever, 55. And the moment he changed his mind and kind of explained why, all of a sudden, again, a small majority was in favor of it. So I believe that, given that the positions aren't so strong, and because, again, this is complex and people don't necessarily know that much about it, political guidance and political leadership can do a lot here. So this isn't the main obstacle in a way, or the main challenge, even though, of course, yes, democratic governments always need to work with the populations they have. And of course, we've also had very heated discussions on these things, no question about it. But generally, I think this isn't the biggest challenge that the population somehow is against this at this point in time. Of course, things can always change.
I think on this topic that you've mentioned of public support and feeling that the military is there to protect you and protect the country rather than to fight in distant wars, I wonder, what would you say is the level of perception of the Russian threat in Germany? Because if, for example, coming from the Czech Republic, I would say that given our geographic proximity and historical experiences, the level of threat is seen and then felt as very very immediate and very close. And the closer you go, or the more east you go, the higher the threat perception is, the higher the military spending budgets tend to be. If you go to the Baltics, it's probably and Poland, it's probably the highest. And then maybe as you go west, it starts to be less immediate. And I wonder, what's the situation in Germany in that respect?
I would say that before the actual invasion, there was no real threat perception with regard to Russia in Germany. Generalizing here, of course, but overall, the thinking in the political realm, but also public realm, was that Russia is a country you trade with, you buy gas from in particular, interesting country culturally speaking. There's this hope that somehow it can democratize. Yes, of course, the annexation of Crimea was, reported and discussed, but I genuinely don't think that, and you could also see this in the political discussion, very few Germans also believe that Putin would really invade. The days before, you still had a lot of people saying in talk shows he's not going to do it, this is not serious, etc., etc. So overall, I think that the perception of Russia as an actually threatening actor was very low, which is why this invasion was such a wake up call. I think on the day of the invasion, people did wake up really worried. And this is why this was such a change and such a shock, because I think for the first time in my generation, people really for a moment thought about, could this be a danger to like myself, my well-being, my security, or at least kind of economic well-being? Is this really something I need to worry about? And we had, in the first winter following the invasion, there were all these fears about Germany potentially running out of gas and people not being able to heat their homes and all of this. So I think there was a real worry kind of with regard to your own security and well-being. That has since died down. I mean, because the war is going on, and yet somehow for Germans, very little has changed. Of course, there are over 1 million Ukrainian refugees. Prices have gone up, especially with regard to energy. The weapons deliveries are fundamental, etc., etc. But still, in the end, you can very easily live in Germany and forget the war. Like that's just the reality. So I think that has gone down, and that also does influence a little bit how people think. The one thing I would highlight, however, that I think is different in Germany than in many other countries is the fear with regard to the nuclear threat. And I'm not really sure where exactly this is coming from. I mean, Germany has a kind of I don't know whether I want to call this strange, but a kind of special relationship, also not a great word, but it has a certain interest in and relationship of and fear of the nuclear, and not just nuclear weapons, but also nuclear power. So we're kind of shut off our nuclear power plants, which many other Europeans think is crazy. So there is a general fear of the nuclear to begin with, and then of nuclear weapons in particular. And you can really feel this in Berlin and in the political discussions. The possibility of a nuclear escalation is something that I feel Germans in general and the German political realm seems to be worrying more than in many other countries. And in the end, I mean, honestly, no one can tell you who's right. I think it is it's of course very rational to think about the nuclear element of this war. Russia is an important nuclear power, and Medvedev and other people quite regularly threaten with their nuclear weapons. So I think it is absolutely important to take this seriously. But there are, of course, also those that say, you kind of can scare yourself into not doing anything with this. Following this logic, you can never face a nuclear power. So it is a debate. But especially, as someone who also has these debates in Paris and France, of course, being a nuclear power in its own right, you really feel a difference in the perception when it comes to the nuclear weapon in Germany than in France. So, yeah, threat perception or the perception of Russia as a threat actor has definitely changed quite dramatically, and the nuclear element is very present. More so than the idea of kind of tanks rolling towards Berlin. I think this is something that's more, as you just described. I mean, this is also a geographical issue, right? The further east you are, the more relevant this is. But Germans now have to think about a lot of things they never thought about before, and that's scaring a lot of people, understandably.
One more question on the topic of the German military before we move more towards the foreign policy and other issues, is the sort of news that made headlines a couple of weeks ago regarding the German military, and that's the leak of the secret communications of German Air Force high commanding officers about the implications of Taurus deliveries to Ukraine. And this has received a lot of attention outside of Germany, and I imagine within Germany as well. But I wonder, in your view, is that something that actually has any significance and maybe tells us something about the German military? Or is it actually an insignificant news tidbit that has just been really blown out of proportion?
I think it has a little bit been blown out of proportion. I mean, A, because that's what we currently do in Germany, and B, because it came at the end of a really bad week for German defense and foreign policy in general. We had a number of things. I mean, the kind of dispute between Macron and Scholz was one. Scholz saying things on the Taurus delivery that really annoyed allies. Also happened, a German frigate almost shot down an American drone by accident in the Red Sea. So it was a really bad week. And on the Friday, then the Russians released this conversation. The conversation itself, I mean, I would put it this way. This is embarrassing, not because the Russians got their hand on it. I think it's very clear that the Russians are trying to listen into everybody's conversation, but that's exactly the point. We know that they're trying to listen into everybody's conversations, so high-level Bundeswehr officials should not join WebEx calls via hotel Wi-Fi and personal mobiles, which apparently is what happened. And unfortunately, by the way, so there was one person who joined the call. We think the analysis things joined the call via kind of a hotel Wi-Fi in Singapore during a big arms trade show where, of course, Russian and certainly also Chinese and other kind of secret service were trying to intercept calls. So that was, just bad and wrong and shouldn't happen. And we now know that apparently another person in this call also joined via kind of an unsecured line. And, I think this is embarrassing because it shows that somehow this threat of being listened to wasn't being taken seriously. And of course, I can't judge whether this was like the one exception or whether this happens all the time. But that the fact that it happened at a very high level and apparently even twice in the same call doesn't give me hope that this is the big exception. I think there is a general fear that this shows that somehow the procedures just aren't there, and that's bad news. And this is something that absolutely needs to change. With regard to the content, I mean, there were a few things in there that we wouldn't have liked to have leaked. But honestly, I mean, the Taurus delivery has been discussed at such a kind of detailed level at this point in every other talk show in Germany that among experts, nothing in this call was like super never heard of. It was kind of interesting, to be honest, to hear their assessment, but it wasn't that I thought like, oh my God, I'd never heard that before, or I'd never thought about it before. But of course, it kind of got the confirmation from high level Bundeswehr people. So very unfortunate. I think pretty clever by the Russians to release this. I think it kind of cemented Scholz's position on just not delivering Taurus. Not that I think this was needed. I think he really has made this decision. And I would, by the way, recommend to move on. Like, this is not the most important thing we should discuss for the next 5 years. He has made his decision. So there we are. But I think now with this leak kind of suggesting that it would be almost impossible to deliver Taurus missiles without some support from the Bundeswehr and some control, et cetera, which is exactly what Scholz wants to avoid. I think that was relatively clever. But I know that allies were quite annoyed. I mean, the Brits in particular. Admittedly, the Brits were already really, really annoyed because of what Scholz had been saying already on the Monday of this horror week, which was about kind of not delivering Taurus, and he alluded to the fact that, well, the Brits have people there and they do all kinds of things, and the Brits were really annoyed that this was then basically confirmed by the Chancellor. So this came up again in this leak, but yeah, so allies were definitely not happy. I think everybody realizes that Russia is trying to listen to them and to intercept calls, and we don't know whether anyone else was also intercepted in different ways, and what else might be leaked from others. But not a great look on any level, really.
Yeah. I think from the Russians' perspective, it was a textbook information operation carried out very successfully. But I think if we're talking about the Taurus missiles, I do have to ask about that. Because I think if we look at in the deliveries to Ukraine in more general, Germany received initially a lot of criticism for not delivering enough, but actually the reality is that it has been a European leader in supplying the military equipment to Ukraine for quite some time by now. But at the same time, there is this issue of this one technology of the Taurus missiles. And I think it's not so much about this one particular weapon, because as we know, no single weapon will have a decisive factor. But why do you think that it's in this specific case, even though that Germany is delivering so much to Ukraine on this particular issue, Olaf Scholz still very stubbornly refuses to do it despite the enormous pressure that he's been facing?
Yeah, so on Germany's support for Ukraine, I think this is important to remember. And in fact, the German politicians keep making this point a lot over the last few weeks and months. But I kind of get it, because it really is important to remember that Germany is, as I was saying, the second most important supporter of Ukraine, following the United States, or third if you count the European Union kind of institutions as well. But on military support, it definitely is the third, because the European Union part is small on that. So, and this is in total numbers, of course, Germany being a big country and a big economy, but as a percentage of GDP, it's at 10th place, which is also still, reasonably good. So the support is really crucial and important, and includes, sometimes you hear a little bit like, oh yeah, but it's just quantity and not quality, which is just not true, because it includes things like the Leopard tanks, combat tanks, which are really important, or the Gepard air defense system, and a number of things. So I think this is really crucial. The reason why, people like me and the government, et cetera, need to repeat this all the time is because over the last years, the impression has been created that Germany is not doing enough, and that Germany is only doing things kicking and streaming. And the thing is, this isn't because somehow no one likes us and things like that, but because the communication of the government has been terrible on this. Because it really did seem as if they were doing things kicking and streaming. And that's just not, that was really unfortunate. And so we had several of these discussions where the focus kind of latched onto kind of a specific weapon system. Like, are you going to this? And this is really decided and decisive. And the Leopard tanks were the most important one. And already at that point, I said, yes, combat tanks are important, but, there is no rule in military science 101 that says, delivering combat tanks is like completely different from everything you've done before. And it's the same with Taurus. Would Taurus be militarily useful for Ukraine? Most certainly. Will it end and change and will it end the war? Will it win the war for Ukraine? I want to say most certainly, but very likely not. So we keep kind of latching on these specific systems in a way that doesn't make sense, in my view. It's not helpful. Why doesn't Scholz want to deliver this? Because, again, you could say, you're doing so much, and you're doing so much that is really military impactful. Like, why not this? Like, why is the red line here? And I think it comes down to two things. Scholz, and I think this is really him personally, more than, even within his government, this is something that is quite controversial. And within the coalition, a lot of people have spoken out and says we absolutely should deliver. Inside the government, of course, they're a bit more toned down, but even inside the government. So this, I think, is quite really him personally as the chancellor. I think he worries about Bundeswehr soldiers being somehow involved. And this is, again, what the leaked conversation somehow showed, is that if you really want to take out Bundeswehr soldier completely, this is very, very, very difficult, if not impossible. Like, you somehow the Bundeswehr needs to kind of help with at least a little bit on how the system works, on programming it, on giving it the data, on putting it under planes. Maybe this can be done by someone else, but there is this element of like, is it possible to deliver this system without the direct help of the Bundeswehr? And if it is not, Scholz genuinely thinks that this is a step too far. This puts Germany too much in a situation where it, may become a party of combat. This is kind of the big discussion in Germany since the beginning. How do we make sure that we are not part of the war? We're supporters, but not part of the war. So this is number one. And the second thing is about control. I think Scholz does not want to give up control completely over this weapon system, which you more or less do when you hand it over, with regard to what targets the Ukrainians might be targeting with it. And that's just his view, and I think it is fueled by what I described earlier, this genuine fear. And I really do, this is not, he is stubborn, let's be honest, but it's not just him being stubborn and somehow irrational. It's not irrational. I think he genuinely fears about an escalation, and has since the very first day, and he fears about a nuclear escalation, and he wants to make sure that, as terrible as this war is, it stays contained as a war between Russia and Ukraine, supported by the West, but not somehow Russia against NATO, Russia against Germany, Russia against other European countries. Which, by the way, then explains why Scholz was so outspoken about Macron's ground troop proposal, and about him not excluding ground troops. So maybe we can come to this, but just to kind of do a little bit of Scholz explaining to the extent that I can, I think his actions really can be explained by a fear, a concern over a risk of escalation. And I find it difficult to really criticize this at a fundamental level, because no one knows what this risk really is. You can't be completely paralyzed by it, because again, then you can't do everything. But I can't really criticize the German chancellor for saying, I judge certain risks, in a certain way, and I'm acting accordingly. I think that's fair, and that's his job. I think sometimes he's doing things wrong, but I kind of, I at least, want to acknowledge that I can understand where he's coming from. But other people judge these risks differently and see them differently, and that's where the divergences within Europe come from, partly.
So let's talk about the issue that we've mentioned, and the issue of European troops in Ukraine. So just to give a little context for everyone who might not have noticed, basically the French president Emmanuel Macron suggested that certain European or that Europe or France might at some point need to deploy troops on the ground in Ukraine, not to take part in combat, but to help with training and advisory to the Ukrainian armed forces. And then the Polish foreign minister, sort of in an offhand comment, claimed or confirmed that some European countries already do have their troops in some kind of a non-combat roles in Ukraine already. So could you maybe talk about how was this entire debate perceived in Germany, and what is the German perspective when it comes to this?
So this was at the end of a conference that Emmanuel Macron organized in Paris, and he invited a number of heads of governments and heads of state, and they discussed many useful things, and Scholz and Macron were actually sitting next to each other, and it looked all nice. And then there was a press conference, and Macron got a question from a reporter asking about the possibility of sending troops to Ukraine. And what he did, and this is really important to underline, is he said, this was discussed, there was no consensus, but I'm not excluding this, and we shouldn't be excluding anything really, because this is a war that is changing. And also, very important term, we need more strategic ambiguity, in the sense that we need to stop telling Putin all the things we're never going to do and we don't do, and kind of draw red lines for us, but rather kind of leave it a little bit open. And then, unfortunately, he went on with comments about, those who always exclude things that have to change their minds and things like that. A criticism that was clearly aimed at Germany. And I think that, by the way, was not clever. And he might be frustrated, and a lot of people are frustrated, but I think it kind of added to the German reaction. So he did not exclude it. He said we need to be ambiguous on a number of things. And so, yeah, he did not propose ground troops. He did not say France would send them. He just said we discussed it, no consensus. I'm not excluding it. Olaf Scholz did not like this in any way and responded primarily, I mean, he responded several times, but primarily in a kind of video and written text on Twitter, where he basically said, there will be no NATO troops or troops from European countries in Ukraine. And I'm against this. And I thought that was a really odd and unfortunate response, because he cannot say this. He can say there will be no German troops. I mean, in the end, it's for the parliament to decide, but he's the leader of the government, so fair enough. He can say there will not be and never be German troops. Totally fine, and I think that's fair. Like, as Macron said, there was no consensus, so if he doesn't want to do that, that's fine. What he can maybe say there will be no NATO troops, because if it really is NATO, he could be kind of vetoing it. But he definitely cannot say there will be no troops from European states. Not the day after the French president literally said, I'm not excluding it. So this was really odd. But in the end, it showed two very different approaches to, again, all things military and kind of strategic thinking between France and Germany. And as someone, I've always worked on Franco-German relations. I studied in France, all of this. There was always this saying that France and Germany have very different strategic cultures. But this was somehow theoretical, right? This was something that think tankers talked about. Now we really see this play out in the real world. This is exactly what is happening here. France has its own strategic culture, which has a history and has a context being, for example, France being a nuclear power. And as a nuclear power, you're also always ambiguous. You never say, I will never use my nuclear weapons, because then, they would be useless. So you have this kind of context there. And then you have Germany with a very different, historical situation and all of this, where this government kind of kept saying what they don't want to do and will never do, and kind of drawing these red lines. And this is what is playing out at the moment. And so instead of, European strategic ambiguity, we have European strategic cacophony, where some people say this, some people say that. Other Europeans have also chimed in, right? You mentioned some have said absolutely not. Some have said maybe. It's a whole mess. It's not useful. I'm more with Macron in the sense that, why do we keep excluding things rather than say, you know what, Putin, we're not going to tell you. Should Europeans send troops? I mean, no, ideally not if it's not necessary. But then the question, of course, also is, what exactly are we talking about? And apparently what Macron and his people are talking about kind of in more detail has to do with, demining and support and things like that. So not French troops fighting Russia. But anyway, I think this is really, difference in strategic culture coming at the forefront. And, intellectually and academically, I find this very interesting. From a European deterrence point of view, it's pretty bad, because Putin must be looking at this and thinking, oh my God, I mean, how, they're not agreeing on anything. This is ridiculous. So this is really not helpful. And there's a little bit of blame to go around on both sides, right? Again, I think Macron really didn't do himself any favors being so clearly, like in the same answer, being so critical of Germany and kind of doing these things. And this also has a history, by the way. We had comments from Scholz before, like, this is not going well, right? And then Scholz really did not handle his answer right on involvement by other Europeans. So not great.
I think one other aspect why I find the French strategic ambiguity not that credible, and if I was Putin, I would probably not be that deterred, and I would wonder what's your view on that, is that the fact that France talks about deploying troops to Ukraine and drawing red lines, but at the same time it's lagging behind Germany and actually many other European countries when it comes to delivering what Ukraine needs at this point. And so you can talking about these radical solutions of deploying your own troops doesn't sound very credible if you're not willing to at this point actually send weapons.
And that's exactly the reaction you get from Berlin, and I get it. So to give you a few numbers again, these are the numbers from the Kiel Institute, which the French have criticized, and I'll tell you why in a second, but these are kind of most widely used and shared numbers. So as I just said, kind of Germany second, or in this ranking third most important deliverer of aid to Ukraine after the EU institutions and the United States. France would be on place 15, and that, of course, as the second biggest economy. So this is total numbers, so second biggest economy, but place 15. If you take it as a percentage of GDP, Germany would be 10th, and France would be 22nd place. So yes, what you said, absolutely right. Now, the French hate these numbers. They say several things. They say, number one, there are a lot of things we deliver that are secret and aren't in these numbers, which might be true. I don't think it is plausible, but there's so much secret stuff that their ranking, if you want to use that term, would change significantly. I can't tell you, but it just seems unlikely. And the second thing that they say is yet that they deliver really important and like high quality and crucial systems, like Caesar cannons and stuff like that, which is also not wrong. It's just a bit odd to say this because, again, like Germany delivers a lot and a lot of really important weapon systems. Like this is, yeah. The reality, I'd say, why France is not delivering so much is that they don't necessarily have as much. I mean, the French military is strong, but it's also in use a lot. Their arsenals aren't very deep, and their military had also been changed quite dramatically to be a military of, how do you say this, a military that intervenes elsewhere rather than doing territorial defense. So in terms of what they have, this is way more about like operations in Africa than defending territory. So the kind of stuff that Ukraine needs. And of course, yes, France is the second largest economy in Europe, but it does struggle economically as well. So it just doesn't have the financial leeway that Germany has. So that's kind of the truth. So I totally get that some people basically say, great, Macron talks this great game and is like grandstanding while Germany is actually doing stuff. And that is not wrong. And again, I think the communication of Germany over the last 2 years has been really bad. And the French communication over the last 2 years has been really good. So that's just one thing. At the same time, and I really want to reiterate this and I kind of emphasize this, I do not think that this is Macron grandstanding. I do not think that this is just Macron coming up yet again with another kind of idea that he just throws out and wants to kind of provoke reactions and all of this. What I've seen over the last months in Paris is that the level of concern over the possibility of Ukraine actually losing this war has gone up dramatically. They are really worried. They're looking at the current situation and saying, this is not going well. They might lose this, and this would be catastrophic for European defense. And I think that's where this is coming from. That doesn't mean that you shouldn't be, or you or like anyone in Berlin shouldn't be criticizing the fact that, yes, France doesn't seem to be doing so much. So if they're really worried, they really should be doing more. But still, I think it is too easy and also unhelpful to kind of say, okay, this is just yet another kind of Macron speech, grandstanding, etc. I don't think that's it. I think there's a real worry here.
Thank you for listening to this conversation. If you'd like to hear the rest of it, you can find it on my Patreon. Click the link in the description or go to patreon.com/decodinggeopolitics. And if you decide to become a supporter, you get bonus content, Patreon-only episodes, and you will be able to ask questions to my future guests.